The quarantine chamber reeked of failure. Elara stood motionless before the reinforced iron bars, her gaze fixed on the figure thrashing against the silver-laced restraints. The sharp bite of antiseptic herbs, wolfsbane, nettleroot, distilled moonflower, should have stung her nostrils. The metallic tang of the feral plague, seeping from her brother's pores like poisoned sweat, should have turned her stomach. The stone floor beneath her slippers should have leached the warmth from her feet after 3 hours of standing vigil. Should have. Instead, she registered the cold as a distant clinical fact. Temperature, approximately 40 degrees. Irrelevant to her work. Elara, Fenrir's voice cracked on her name, lucid for a heartbeat before his spine arched violently. Bone cracked. Muscle tore. His left arm convulsed, fingers elongating into claws that gouged deep furrows into the stone table. The partial shift was involuntary, agonizing stage 1 symptoms accelerating faster than her calculations had predicted. She did not flinch. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision, tracing sigils in the air. Pale blue light pooled at her fingertips, weaving through the bars to settle over Fenrir's contorted form. The sedation spell required absolute focus. Even the slightest tremor of emotion would shatter the delicate matrix of magic. Fear would make her hand shake. Grief would cloud her intent. Love would blind her to the necessary cruelty of binding her own brother like a rabid animal. The ritual of the seal had stripped all of that away. Fenrir's breathing slowed. The claws retracted with wet, sucking sounds. His eyes still clear, still human, still. Fenrir found hers through the blue haze. How? How long? His voice was raw, scraped hollow by screaming. Elara tilted her head, calculating. Memory lapses had begun 4 days ago. Heightened aggression, 6. The partial shifts were increasing in frequency 3 in the past 12 hours alone. Without intervention, he would reach stage 2 within a fortnight. Stage 3, by the next blood moon. Long enough, she said. The words emerged flat, stripped of the comfort she knew he needed but could no longer provide. Her brother's face crumpled a flicker of devastation before the sedation dragged him under. She observed his descent into unconsciousness with the detachment of a scholar noting data. Heart rate, decreasing. Respiration, stabilizing. Prognosis, terminal. The locket at her throat pulsed once, a cool weight against her sternum. Silver, engraved with binding runes, anchoring the seal that had saved her sanity and stolen her humanity in equal measure. She had performed the ritual of the seal 3 years ago, when Fenrir first contracted the plague. Control had been the price of attempting his cure. Emotion was chaos. Chaos made her magic imprecise. She could not afford imprecision, but the plague was adapting faster than she could counter it. Elara's gaze swept the chamber, the discarded vials of failed remedies, the journals crammed with useless theories, the silver restraints that grew tighter each day. She had exhausted every text in her kingdom's libraries, every alchemical combination, every healing ritual passed down through her bloodline. The answer was not here. It was in Lycanthra, in the Werewolf Kingdom's royal archives, where the oldest magics were hoarded like dragon gold. Where the cure, if one existed, lay buried beneath centuries of secrets. Fenrir's chest rose and fell, deceptively peaceful in his enchanted sleep. Elara's hand drifted to the locket, touched the cold metal, made her decision. She would go to Lycanthra. She would access those archives, regardless of the cost. The city was burning, and Callan could taste it. Not literally, though. The acrid smoke seeping through the solar's windows coated his tongue like ash. No, he tasted the fear rising from the streets below, bitter and caustic, mingling with the copper-bright rage of a population, turning feral with desperation. Every howl from the riots stabbed into his eardrums like hot iron. Every crash of breaking glass reverberated through his skull until his teeth ached with it. His senses had always been sharper than any alpha's. A gift, they'd called it once. A curse. He knew better. Callan stood before the window, spine rigid, fingers locked behind his back to hide their tremor. The discipline was automatic now, centuries of practice, compressing every reaction, every flinch, every indication that the world was too much. The stone beneath his boots thrummed with the footfalls of guards 3 floors below. The tapestries whispered against the walls with each breath of wind. Somewhere in the eastern wing, a servant dropped a tray. The clatter exploded through his awareness like shattering bone. He did not move. Movement invited more sensation, more input, more of the suffocating, unrelenting noise of existence. The 3rd riot this week, Your Majesty. Lord Valerius's voice cut through the chaos, measured and cool. The beta stood near the war table, fingers steepled, his expression a mask of calculated concern. The pack grows restless. They believe you've abandoned them to the plague. Callan's jaw tightened. The scent of Valerius's ambition sharp, metallic, hungry coiled through the solar like a serpent. He'd smelled it for months now, growing stronger. But Valerius was useful. Intelligent. The only advisor who hadn't fled when the plague began devouring the kingdom from within. They're dying, Callan said, voice flat. Emotion was a luxury he could not afford. It fed the wolf prowling beneath his skin, the beast that strained against his control every moment of every endless day. I have not forgotten. Then, perhaps it's time to consider alternative solutions. Valerius moved to the table, unrolling a scroll with deliberate care. Parchment. Aged and brittle. The scent of old magic, stale roses, and graveyard dirt wafted from the yellowed surface. Callan turned, looked, regretted it immediately. The candlelight was too bright, lancing into his retinas. The runes on the parchment seemed to writhe, their edges too sharp, too defined. He forced himself to focus, to parse the archaic script through the white-hot agony blooming behind his eyes. The stone heart shall shatter only when the Wolf King weds the Heartless Princess, and selfless love triumphs over immortal desire. The words settled over him like a shroud. A prophecy, Valerius said quietly. Hidden in Lysandra's effects. I've had scholars confirm its authenticity. Lysandra. The name alone was a wound that had never healed, not in 5 centuries, not through 100 potential mates turned to stone, not through the endless parade of guilt that wore grooves into his immortal soul. The mage, who had cursed his line, the woman his ancestor had destroyed. The Heartless Princess, Callan repeated. His voice was ice over jagged glass. You waste my time with riddles while my kingdom burns. Princess Elara of House Waylan. Valerius's lips curved, not quite a smile. The mage healer. They call her heartless because she feels nothing, sealed her own emotions away with blood magic to achieve perfect control. She's been treating her brother, a plague victim, in the quarantine wing since yesterday. Callan's gaze snapped to the beta. Here, she arrived petitioning for access to the royal archives. I denied her, naturally, but given the prophecy. Valerius gestured to the scroll. A marriage alliance could stabilize the kingdom, give the pack hope, and if the prophecy holds even a fragment of truth, if the prophecy held truth, Callan would finally break the curse that had turned him into a monument to isolation. He would love, and she would die, and he would add another statue to his collection of failures. Unless, heartless, if she could not feel, she could not trigger the curse. If she had sealed away emotion, perhaps, just perhaps, she was the loophole Lysandra had never anticipated. The riots roared beyond the window, his people screamed, the plague spread, and Callan, who had survived 5 centuries by feeling nothing, made his choice. Summon her, he said. Elara felt the Alpha King's presence before she saw him. Not through instinct or intuition, the seal had muted those softer senses, along with everything else. No, she observed it. The sudden rigidity in the guard's postures, the way the air itself seemed to compress, the shift in ambient temperature as something predatory entered the corridor. She turned from the infirmary entrance, her movements economical, and met the Wolf King's gaze. Alpha King Callan was a study in controlled violence. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of sculpted musculature that spoke of centuries honing a weapon. His face was all brutal angles, sharp jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone, pale eyes the color of winter frost, dark hair swept back to reveal the rigid tendons in his neck. He looked like a man standing on the knife's edge of transformation, every muscle coiled, every breath measured. Elara catalogued it all with clinical precision: elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, micro-expressions of pain around the eyes and mouth, stress indicators. He was suffering, constantly, if she had to guess. Interesting. Princess Elara. His voice was a low rasp, stripped of warmth. I understand you seek access to my archives. Not a question. A statement. She noted Lord Valerius hovering at the king's shoulder, expression unreadable. Yes. She did not elaborate, did not justify or plead or negotiate. Simply confirmed. Callan's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, a deliberate invasion of space, a dominance display she'd read about in texts on werewolf sociology. The scent of him should have overwhelmed her. Pine and smoke and the musk of predator. His proximity should have triggered fear, or, at minimum, self-preservation. Should have. I will grant you unrestricted access, Callan said slowly, each word carved from granite. In exchange for a marriage alliance. You will become my Luna, my queen. Elara blinked once. Processed. A transactional proposal. Marriage for access. The political calculus was obvious. A human Luna would appease the restless pack, demonstrate solidarity between kingdoms, project strength during crisis. For her, it meant the archives. Every forbidden text, every sealed grimoire, every scrap of research that might save Fenrir. The cost was irrelevant. She had already sacrificed everything that mattered. I accept, she said. The words emerged flat, clinical, utterly devoid of fear or hesitation, or any of the emotions a woman should feel when a predator king demanded her hand. Callan's nostrils flared, his head tilted fractionally, confusion flickering across his brutal features. He was scenting her, she realized, searching for the fear response that wasn't there. You! He trailed off, brow furrowing. You don't. I sealed my emotions 3 years ago. Elara interrupted, her tone as empty as the void where her heart used to beat. The ritual of the seal. I am, as they say, heartless. She paused, then added with perfect, devastating precision. Will that be a problem, Your Majesty? For a long moment, Callan simply stared. And in his frost-pale eyes, Elara saw something she had not anticipated. Unease. The Wolf King, who had surely faced down armies and challengers and the weight of immortal centuries, was unsettled by her absence, by the void where fear should have lived. No, he finally said, though his voice had lost its certainty. The wedding will be tomorrow. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a death knell. Elara's fingers found her locket, held it, felt nothing. Tomorrow, she would marry a monster. Tonight, she would prepare to save her brother. The cost, as always, was irrelevant. The great hall was a cathedral of judgment. Callan stood before the ancient stone altar, every muscle locked in place, and endured the weight of 1,000 eyes. The pack filled the hall nobility in their formal blacks and silvers, common wolves pressed shoulder to shoulder in the galleries above, guards lining the walls with hands on sword hilts. Their collective presence was a physical assault, the rustle of fabric like sandpaper against his eardrums, the mingled sense of suspicion and fear, and barely restrained hostility thick enough to choke on. They did not want a human Luna. The murmurs rippled through the crowd, razor-edged whispers that sliced into his consciousness. Human, weak, unworthy. What is he thinking? The kingdom falls and he takes a bride. Has the curse driven him mad at last? Callan's jaw clenched hard enough to crack bone. He forced his breathing to remain steady, forced his gaze to remain fixed on the massive doors at the hall's entrance. The Gothic arches soared overhead, carved with the history of his cursed lineage, wolves and moons, and the petrified faces of those he'd loved and destroyed. The irony was not lost on him. Lord Valerius stood beside the altar, resplendent in ceremonial robes, the ancient wedding text open in his hands. His expression was appropriately solemn, but Callan caught the thread of satisfaction in his scent. Valerius had orchestrated this, had presented the prophecy, the solution, the perfect political chess move. Callan hated that he'd had no choice but to accept it. The doors groaned open. Princess Elara entered alone. No procession, no attendants, no trembling father to give her away, or weeping mother to bid her farewell. She walked down the center aisle with the measured gait of someone approaching a surgical table rather than a marriage altar, her silver gown chosen by his staff, clearly catching the torchlight like moonlight on water. Her dark hair was unbound, falling in straight lines past her shoulders. Her face was porcelain smooth, unmarred by expression. Beautiful, in the way a marble statue was beautiful. Dead, in every way that mattered. The crowd's murmurs sharpened into outright whispers as she passed. Callan scented their disdain, their disbelief, their anger at this foreign mage who dared claim the title of Luna. A few younger wolves in the gallery bared teeth. A low growl rippled through the assembly. Elara didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even glance toward the sound. She simply walked, reached the altar, and stopped precisely 3 feet from Callan. Her hazel eyes met his not with defiance or fear or even resignation, just assessment, as though she were cataloging him the way a scholar cataloged a specimen. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice carried no inflection, no warmth. "Princess," he returned, equally cold. Valerius cleared his throat. "We are gathered under the light of the Moon Mother to witness the union of Alpha King Callan of Lycanthra and Princess Elara of House Waylan." The words were ritual, ancient, carved into werewolf tradition for millennia. In this binding, the pack gains a Luna, the kingdom gains stability. 2 souls become one, under the eternal watch of. A scoff echoed from the gallery. Someone a young beta by the scent muttered loud enough to carry. "One soul. The other's a corpse who walks." Laughter, quickly stifled. But the damage was done. Callan's wolf surged, a tide of rage and dominance that demanded he rip the throat from the challenger, that he assert his authority through violence and blood. His vision sharpened to predatory focus, his canines lengthening, his "Continue, Lord Valerius." Elara's flat voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel through flesh. The hall fell silent. Callan's wolf subsided, confused by the lack of reaction, the absence of fear scent that should have flooded the space. He forced his breathing to even, forced his canines to retract. Elara hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. She'd simply dismissed the insult. As though it were irrelevant data, Valerius recovered smoothly. "The vows, Your Majesty." Callan turned to face Elara fully. The traditional Lycanthran vows were short, blunt, more contract than poetry. "I, Callan, Alpha King of Lycanthra, claim you as Luna. Your protection is my burden. Your strength is my pack's foundation. Your life is bound to mine until death severs the bond." He waited, watched her face for any flicker of emotion, fear at the finality, anger at the possessive language, even sardonic amusement at the archaic phrasing. Nothing. I, Elara of House Waylan, accept the claim. Her words were precise, measured. I will serve as Luna. I will uphold the pack's welfare. I am bound until death. The hall seemed to hold its breath. The marking, Valerius prompted quietly. The traditional Lycanthran claim. A bite to the throat or wrist, marking the Luna with the Alpha's scent, binding her to pack and kingdom in a way that transcended human marriage. It was intimate, possessive, a public declaration of ownership that Callan had always found distasteful but necessary. He stepped closer. Elara tilted her head fractionally, exposing the pale column of her throat with the clinical efficiency of a patient positioning themselves for a physician's examination. Callan's fingers closed around her wrist instead, a concession, a small mercy. Her skin was cool, her pulse steady, no spike of fear, no acceleration of heartbeat, just the mechanical rhythm of a body performing its functions. He lowered his head, pressed his lips to the delicate skin of her inner wrist. Felt the wolf rise, instinct demanding he bite, mark, claim. He bit, not deeply, just enough to break skin, to leave the mark, to flood her system with his scent. Elara didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She simply stood there, watching him with those empty hazel eyes, as though he were performing a mildly interesting experiment. Callan released her wrist, stepped back, tasted her blood on his tongue, human, clean, utterly devoid of the complex cocktail of pheromones and emotions that should have accompanied such an intimate act. It unsettled him more than anything had in a century. By the Moon Mother's witness, Valerius declared, voice ringing through the hall. I pronounce you bound. Alpha and Luna, King and Queen, may your union bring stability to the kingdom and strength to the pack. The hall erupted in polite, perfunctory applause. No cheers, no celebration, just the hollow sound of duty. Acknowledged. Callan looked at his new wife, his Luna, his queen, his political necessity, and wondered what he'd truly bound himself to. Elara met his gaze, nodded once, then turned and walked out of the great hall with the same measured stride she'd entered with, leaving him standing at the altar like a groom abandoned at his own wedding. The murmurs began again immediately. Callan ignored them, forced himself to follow his bride into their new, cold alliance. The royal suite was a gilded cage. Elara stood in the center of the Luna's chambers, cataloging, vaulted ceilings, approximately 18 feet high, 4 arched windows, facing east, based on the fading light, furnishings, mahogany wardrobe, canopied bed large enough for 3 people, vanity with an ornate mirror, sitting area with velvet chairs, positioned before an enormous fireplace, currently blazing with heat. She registered as an abstract concept rather than a physical sensation. Luxury, comfort, warmth, all irrelevant. She moved to the nearest window, pressed her palm against the glass. Cold, logically. The temperature differential between the heated room and the exterior glass should have created a pleasant contrast. Instead, she noted the pressure against her skin, the slight condensation forming at the edges of the pane, the distant lights of the city below, where riots had burned just last night. The door opened behind her. Elara turned. Alpha King Callan filled the doorway, still in his ceremonial blacks, his expression carved from the same granite as the castle walls. He didn't enter immediately, just stood on the threshold, as though uncertain of his welcome in what was technically her domain now. We should discuss arrangements, he said. His voice was carefully neutral, but she detected the underlying tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. Still in pain, then. The sensory overload she'd observed during the ceremony hadn't abated. Yes, Elara agreed. She gestured to the sitting area. Please. Callan entered, moved to one of the velvet chairs but didn't sit. Instead, he stood beside it, fingers gripping the back hard enough that she heard the wood creak. The pack expects. I require immediate access to the royal archives. Elara interrupted. She saw no point in preamble. Unrestricted. All sections, including those sealed by royal decree. That was the agreement. His jaw tightened. The agreement was marriage for access. You have the marriage. Then I expect the access. Tomorrow morning. She tilted her head, studying him. Unless you intended to renege on the transaction. Transaction. He repeated the word with something that might have been bitter amusement in a man capable of expressing such things. Is that what you call this? What else would I call it? Elara moved away from the window, positioning herself near the door to her private study, a smaller chamber attached to the main suite. You require political stability. I require research materials. We have exchanged vows to facilitate those needs. Transaction is the accurate term. Callan stared at her. His nostrils flared, scenting again, she realized, searching for something he wouldn't find. Most women would have demands beyond library access on their wedding night. I am not most women. No. His voice dropped, rough. You're not. Silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed midnight. Elara broke the silence first. I propose we maintain separate chambers, separate lives, within the bounds of public expectation. You have your duties, I have my research. We will appear together when politically necessary. Otherwise, we need not complicate this arrangement with proximity. She watched his face for reaction, saw relief flicker across his brutal features before he locked it down again. Agreed, he said curtly. My chambers are in the west wing. A guard will escort you to the archives at dawn. He turned toward the door, then paused. Looked back at her with those frost-pale eyes. The pack will expect heirs. Eventually is not tonight, Elara replied. Or any night in the foreseeable future. Another pause. Then, barely audible. No, I suppose it isn't. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Elara stood alone in her gilded cage, surrounded by luxury she couldn't feel, and warmth she couldn't sense, and felt nothing. Exactly as it should be. She moved to the study, where her traveling trunks had been delivered. Time to work. The silver came from her mother's jewelry box. Elara sat at the study desk, her tools arranged with surgical precision. The antique necklace she'd dismantled, thin silver wire, engraving tools, a small crucible heating over a contained flame, vials of distilled essences. Wolfsbane, white ash, purified moon water. The components of the ritual of the seal, rendered physical. The castle was too loud. Even with her muted senses, she perceived the chaos. Footsteps in distant corridors, voices through stone walls, the ever-present hum of werewolf energy that saturated this place like humidity. The pack's suspicion had been palpable in the great hall, their hostility a tangible pressure against her consciousness. She needed reinforcement. A stronger anchor. Her hands moved with practiced precision, shaping the silver into a locket. Oval, approximately 2 inches in length, the metal warm from the heat but registering only as pressure against her fingertips. She engraved the binding runes with microscopic care. Old Cantic symbols for stillness, control, separation. Each line had to be perfect. Magic was mathematics. Imprecision meant failure. The wolfsbane essence went into the hollow interior. 3 drops of moon water, a strand of her own hair, severed and placed inside before she sealed the 2 halves together. Then came the magic. Elara closed her eyes unnecessary, but it helped maintain focus and reached for the well of power that lived beneath her sternum. Cold, clinical, vast as an ice field. The ritual of the seal had transformed her magic from a wild, emotional force into something crystalline and controllable. She spoke the words in the old tongue, each syllable precise. Clausura cordis, vincula sensuum, per argentum ligatum. Close the heart, bind the senses, through silver, bound. The locket grew cold in her hands. Frost rimed its surface, then faded. The runes glowed pale blue for a heartbeat before settling into the metal like scars. Elara opened her eyes, examined her work. Perfect. She lifted the locket, threaded it onto a silver chain, and clasped it around her neck. The weight settled against her sternum, not heavy, but present. Anchoring. She touched the cool metal with her fingertips, testing. The pressure registered. The temperature registered as data, approximately 52 degrees, several degrees cooler than ambient room temperature, due to the magic infused within. But she felt nothing else. No comfort from the familiar ritual, no satisfaction at the successful crafting, no fear of the werewolf court beyond her door. Just the void, the blessed, necessary void. Elara's hand dropped away from the locket. She turned to the stack of journals she'd brought from home, 3 years of failed research on the feral plague, every dead end meticulously documented. Tomorrow, she would have the royal archives, access to centuries of Lycanthran magical theory, records of Lysandra's work, perhaps even the original curse texts. Tomorrow, she would find a cure for Fenrir. Tonight, she reinforced the seal that made such precision possible. The fire in the main chamber died to embers. The castle settled into its midnight rhythms. And Elara sat in her study, fingers tracing the locket at her throat, feeling only the pressure of metal against skin. Numb, controlled, powerful, exactly as she needed to be. The restricted section existed behind 3 layers of wards. Elara stood before the iron gate, examining the magical signatures with clinical interest. Blood magic in the first layer keyed to the royal lineage, requiring alpha authorization for entry. Temporal locking in the second, the gate would only open during specific lunar phases, unless overridden. And the third layer was pure deterrence, a curse that would strip the memory from anyone who entered without permission, leaving them wandering and confused. Effective, elegant, utterly impenetrable without the proper keys. Frustrating, isn't it? Elara turned. Lord Valerius approached through the stacks, his footsteps silent on the stone floor despite his considerable size. The beta wore his customary dark formal attire, silver threading glinting in the mage light. His expression was carefully sympathetic, a mask she'd observed him wearing frequently around the court. Lord Valerius, she acknowledged. Please, just Valerius. We're family now, in a manner of speaking. He stopped beside her, gazing at the warded gate with what appeared to be shared frustration. I've seen you here every day for a week. The general archives aren't yielding results, I take it. Elara saw no reason to lie. The available texts contain nothing I haven't already studied in my own kingdom. The cure, if one exists, is likely behind that gate. Likely, Valerius agreed. He was quiet for a moment then. How is your brother? The question registered as data, an attempt to establish rapport through shared concern, standard manipulation technique. But the information itself was relevant. Deteriorating, Elara said. Stage 1 is progressing faster than my models predicted. He has perhaps 10 days before entering Stage 2. I'm sorry. Valerius's tone carried what sounded like genuine sympathy. The plague has taken much from many of us. My own sister contracted it 2 years ago. She lasted 3 months. He paused. The king did nothing. Elara's gaze sharpened fractionally. Your Majesty has been attempting to contain the outbreak. Has he? Valerius's voice remained carefully neutral. Or has he been too consumed by his own curse to address the kingdom's needs? 5 centuries of isolation tends to distort one's priorities. You disapprove of your king. Statement not question. I serve my king, Valerius corrected. But I also serve the kingdom. Sometimes those loyalties conflict. He turned to face her fully. I witnessed his display in the Eastern Corridor 3 days ago. The aggression. The loss of control. You handled it admirably, but others might not have fared as well. Elara processed this. Valerius had been observing, cataloging, drawing conclusions about the dynamics between her and Callan. The information was either a warning or a weapon, possibly both. Alpha dominance displays are within expected behavioral parameters, she said. Are they? When directed at one's own Luna. Valerius's expression shifted to concern. Princess Elara, I don't mean to alarm you. But the Alpha King's volatility has been increasing. The curse weighs heavily on him. His sensory overload makes him unpredictable. And you. He gestured at her with careful delicacy. You have no fear response to protect yourself if his control slips entirely. The logic was sound. Callan's wolf had indeed surfaced during their confrontation. Without a natural fear response, Elara would not instinctively retreat from genuine danger. The seal that granted her precision also stripped away a critical survival mechanism. What are you suggesting? She asked. Valerius moved closer to the gate, his voice dropping to confidential tones. The restricted section contains texts on alpha physiology, ancient rituals, including methods to temporarily suppress alpha power, not permanently, not harmfully, but enough to ensure safety during periods of instability. He met her gaze. For the kingdom's protection. For your own protection. Elara's analytical mind parsed the suggestion. Temporary suppression of alpha power would indeed provide a safeguard. If Callan lost control during the blood moon, or if his sensory overload finally broke him, a suppression method could prevent catastrophic damage. It was pragmatic, logical, and yet, you're asking me to research how to neutralize my husband, she said flatly. I'm asking you to research how to protect him, Valerius corrected. And the kingdom. And yourself. Knowledge is simply knowledge, Elara. What one does with it determines whether it's weapon or shield. He paused. I can grant you access to the restricted section. Temporarily. Enough time to find what you need for your brother and to review the alpha suppression techniques. All I ask is that you share any findings that might help stabilize the king during this crisis. Elara studied him. Valerius's heartbeat was steady, trained control, likely, given his beta status. His scent carried traces of ambition, but that was hardly unusual in court politics. His logic was sound. His offer was valuable. Her brother was dying. The cure was behind that gate. And if understanding alpha suppression helped her manage Callan's volatility while she worked, so much the better. Very well, she said. Valerius smiled warm, almost paternal. He withdrew a silver key from his pocket, ornate and clearly ancient. This will bypass the first 2 wards. The third requires a password. Memoria servet. Memory serves. He placed the key in her palm. Take whatever time you need. And Elara? Be careful. Some knowledge carries more weight than others. He left her there, the key cold in her hand. Elara turned back to the gate, inserted the key, spoke the password. The wards dissolved like morning mist, and the iron gate swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. She stepped into the restricted section, surrounded by texts bound in materials that whispered of dark magic and desperate measures, and began her research. Fenrir's cure was somewhere in this knowledge. And if she also found methods to suppress alpha power well, knowledge was simply knowledge. What mattered was precision. The outpost stank of death and desperation. Callan stood in the center of what had once been a thriving village, now reduced to a quarantine zone surrounded by silver-laced barriers. 15 buildings, half of them burned. Bodies in the square, 6 wolves who'd gone fully feral and had to be put down by the guards. The survivors huddled in the remaining structures, their fear so thick in the air it coated his tongue like rancid oil. The sensory assault was staggering. Smoke and blood, and the distinctive rot-sweet smell of the feral plague. Screams from the quarantine tents where the infected thrashed against restraints. The constant, arrhythmic heartbeats of dying wolves. The metallic tang of silver weapons gripped by terrified guards. Callan's jaw locked, his entire body rigid with the effort of processing the input without losing control. Stage 2, Elara said beside him, her voice cutting through the chaos with clinical precision. At least 8 victims showing advanced symptoms. They'll reach stage 3 within days. She'd accompanied him without hesitation when the messenger arrived at dawn reporting the outbreak. Had simply gathered her supplies, informed him she would need to examine the plague directly, and walked to the stables to prepare for travel. No fear of the plague. No reluctance to enter a quarantine zone. Just pragmatic acceptance of necessity. Now she moved through the devastation like a scholar navigating a library, examining bodies and magical residue with equal detachment. Callan watched her crouch beside a victim, a young male, maybe 20. His body locked in a permanent half-shift. Claws extended, spine curved at an unnatural angle, jaw distended with fangs that had erupted through his gums in agonizing profusion. The boy's eyes were still open, still aware, trapped in a prison of his own mutated flesh. Elara placed her palm against his forehead. Blue light flickered around her fingers as she traced the magical signature of the plague through his system. Fascinating, she murmured. The curse doesn't just trigger transformation, it corrupts it. Forces the body through incomplete shifts until the physiological structure collapses entirely. Can you help him? Callan's voice came out rougher than intended. No. Elara withdrew her hand. The boy's breathing was labored, wet. His human consciousness is already fragmenting. Stage 3 will claim him by nightfall. The merciful option would be sedation and a quick end. She said it without inflection. Simple medical assessment. But Callan felt the weight of those words like stones on his chest. 20 years old. Dead by nightfall. Another life, claimed by a curse he couldn't break. The magical signature, he said, forcing himself to focus on the investigation rather than the guilt. What is it? Elara stood, brushing dust from her trousers. Dark magic. Old magic. The foundational structure matches texts I've seen on emotion-based curses. She turned to him, hazel eyes sharp with analytical focus. You said the stone heart curse was cast by a mage named Lycanthra. Centuries ago. 500 years, Callan confirmed. She cursed my ancestor after he rejected her. Every Alpha King since has inherited the curse. Anyone I love turns to stone. Emotion-based casting. Elara said, nodding. Powerful, but unstable. Emotions are chaotic by nature. Rage, heartbreak, obsession. When a curse is fueled by such raw feeling, it tends to leak. She gestured at the dying boy. This plague has the same magical signature as what I'd expect from your stone heart curse. It's not a separate curse, it's a consequence. Lycanthra's rage and pain were so profound, so all-consuming, that the curse couldn't be fully contained. The excess magic is seeping out, corrupting the transformation process in werewolves throughout the kingdom. The pieces clicked together, with horrible clarity. The stone heart curse wasn't just destroying Callan's ability to love, it was poisoning his entire kingdom. Every feral wolf, every destroyed family, every life claimed by the plague could be traced directly back to the curse on his bloodline. How do we stop it? He asked. Break the source curse, Elara's tone was matter of fact. Sever the stone heart, and the plague ends. The foundational magic collapses, and the leak stops. And if we can't break it, she met his gaze. Then the plague continues, accelerates, likely. Lysandra's original emotional state was unstable. 5 centuries of festering rage doesn't improve with age. The curse will grow stronger, the leak will worsen, and eventually, she paused. Eventually, there won't be a kingdom left to rule. Callan's hands curled into fists. 5 centuries of isolation, of rigid control, of sacrificing every chance at connection, all of it meaningless if the curse destroyed everything anyway. The futility of it crashed over him like a wave. Then he felt it a feather-light touch on his forearm. He looked down. Elara's fingers rested against his sleeve, barely making contact, her expression unchanged but her intent clear, grounding. She'd observed his spiraling stress response and intervened with the same clinical precision she applied to everything else. "We have a shared goal now," she said quietly. "Your curse and my brother's cure are the same problem. We work together, or we both fail." Callan stared at those pale fingers against the dark fabric of his sleeve. The touch registered through the sensory overload pressure, temperature, the faint pulse point at her wrist. Not comforting, exactly, but anchoring. A point of focus in the chaos. "Alliance," he said. "Alliance." Elara confirmed. She withdrew her hand. Turned back to the dying village. "We should collect samples of the plague's magical residue. If we can trace the signature back to its source, we might find Lysandra's location, or at minimum, identify weaknesses in the curse structure." Callan nodded. Forced himself to move, to function, to channel the guilt into action. They had a direction now. A purpose. Break the Stoneheart curse. Save the kingdom. Save her brother. And try not to add another statue to his garden in the process. "There's a supply building on the eastern edge," he said. "We can work there without." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost erupted across the ground, spreading from the village center in crystalline fractals. The air itself seemed to harden, becoming thick and difficult to breathe. And beneath it all, Callan felt a presence ancient, powerful, seething with centuries of rage. "Callan." Elara's voice was sharp. "We have a problem." The stones were moving. Elara watched with clinical detachment as the cobblestones in the village square began to tear themselves free, hovering in the air like insects swarming. 20 stones. 30. 50. Each one humming with dark magic, their surfaces rippling as though alive. Manifestation magic. Projection. Likely the caster wasn't physically present, but channeling power through a remote anchor. The signature was the same as the plague, the same as the Stoneheart curse, but concentrated, focused with lethal intent. "Lysandra, she knows we're investigating," Callan growled beside her. His eyes had gone full amber, his canines extended, his body coiled for combat. The alpha power rolled off him in waves: dominance, aggression, protective fury. Elara's analytical mind parsed the situation rapidly. 50 animated projectiles, each weighing approximately 5 pounds, moving with supernatural coordination. Velocity would be lethal upon impact. Standard shielding wouldn't hold against that many simultaneous strikes. They needed tactical precision. "I can counter the animation," she said, her voice flat despite the chaos. "But I need 30 seconds of uninterrupted focus. Can you provide defense?" Callan's response was a feral snarl that sent the remaining guards fleeing. "Get behind me." Elara moved immediately, positioning herself at his back. She could feel the heat radiating from him, his temperature had spiked with the partial transformation, his body priming for violence. The scent of wolf musk and pine intensified, mixing with the metallic tang of adrenaline. The stones attacked. They came in waves, streaking through the air like arrows. Callan moved with inhuman speed, his clawed hands batting projectiles aside, his body twisting to intercept the ones aimed at Elara. Stone shattered against his forearms, impacts that would have pulverized human bone, but only drew thin lines of blood against his werewolf-enhanced durability. Elara ignored the sounds of combat, focused on the magical signature threading through the animated stones, found the connection point a tether of dark magic anchored to. There, a raven perched on the burned remains of a roof, its eyes glowing with the same malevolent intelligence she'd felt in the temperature drop. Proxy vessel, elegant solution for remote casting. She began the counterspell, her fingers tracing sigils with mechanical precision. The ritual of the seal granted her perfect focus even amidst chaos, no fear to distract her, no panic to make her hands shake. Just cold, clinical calculation. The stones intensified their assault. 3 got past Callan's defense, streaking toward her head. He moved faster than should have been possible, his body interposing itself between her and the projectiles. Stone impacted his shoulder, his ribs, his thigh. She heard bone crack, smelled fresh blood. "Keep working," he snarled. Elara's hands didn't falter. 20 seconds. The counterspell's matrix was forming, pale blue light spreading from her fingertips into complex geometric patterns. The raven cawed a sound laced with dark magic that made reality shudder. The remaining stones began to glow red, heating rapidly. Molten stone. Even Callan's enhanced durability wouldn't survive molten stone to the face. 10 seconds. Callan's breathing was labored, blood soaked through his shirt, but he held position, his body a living shield, taking hit after hit while she worked. "Elara." His voice was strained. "Whatever you're doing, done." The counterspell activated. Blue light exploded outward from Elara's hands, racing through the air to intersect every thread of Lysandra's magic. The matrix she'd built was perfectly calibrated not to overpower the dark magic, which would have required more strength than she possessed, but to sever the connection between caster and vessel. Surgical precision over brute force. The stones dropped like dead weight, clattering harmlessly to the ground. The raven's eyes flared once, twice, then dimmed. It toppled from the roof, dead before it hit the ground. Feedback from the severed connection. Silence descended over the village, broken only by Callan's harsh breathing. Elara stepped around him, assessing. 3 cracked ribs, based on the breathing pattern. Dislocated shoulder. Multiple lacerations. Minor concussion, likely, from the impact to his temple. Nothing immediately fatal, but painful and debilitating without treatment. "Sit," she instructed. "I'm fine," Callan ground out, but his legs were shaking. "You have 3 cracked ribs and a concussion. Sit, or you'll collapse and compound the injuries." She pointed to a relatively intact section of wall. Now, something in her tone, the same clinical authority she used on Fenrir when he tried to refuse treatment, made the Alpha King comply. He moved to the wall, sat heavily, and allowed her to approach. Elara knelt beside him, her hands already glowing with healing magic. Not her specialty, but she knew enough field medicine to stabilize. She placed her palm against his ribs, feeling for the fractures, and began knitting the bone back together with precise applications of power. Callan hissed through his teeth. "That hurts worse than the breaking." Healing accelerates cellular regeneration. The pain receptors interpret rapid tissue repair as damage. She moved to his shoulder, manipulating the joint back into place with a sharp crack. "Your enhanced metabolism will complete the process within hours." "Comforting," he muttered. She worked in silence, repairing the worst of the damage. Her hands moved over his skin hot to the touch, burning with the aftermath of transformation, but she registered only the medical data. Temperature, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Heart rate, elevated, but stabilizing. Muscle tension, decreasing as the pain faded. You used yourself as a shield, Elara said, still focused on healing the lacerations across his forearm. Strategically inefficient. If you'd been incapacitated, we both would have died. You needed time to work. Callan's voice was rough. I gave it to you. At significant personal cost. That's what partners do. Partners. The word hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of what had just occurred. They'd worked together, instinctively, without discussion or planning. Callan had protected her. She'd neutralized the threat. They'd survived through mutual cooperation. Alliance. Formalized through action rather than words. Elara withdrew her hands, the healing complete. Lycanthra is aware of our investigation. She'll escalate. Let her. Callan's amber eyes met hers, still bright with residual wolf light. We know what we're facing now. And we're not facing it alone. For the first time since accepting this political marriage, Elara recognized something beyond transaction in their arrangement. Not partnership in the emotional sense, she was incapable of that, but partnership in the tactical sense. Two people with complementary skills working toward a shared objective. We should return to the castle, she said, standing. Analyze the magical signature I captured during the counterspell, cross-reference with the archive texts. Lycanthra made a mistake. Attacking us directly, she gave us data. Callan rose as well, testing his repaired ribs with careful movements. Agreed. And Elara, she paused. Thank you. For the healing. And for. He gestured at the scattered stones, the dead raven. Everything. Elara tilted her head fractionally. Gratitude. An emotional response she couldn't reciprocate but could acknowledge intellectually. You're welcome. They left the dying village together, side by side, united by necessity and bound by the same curse that threatened to destroy them both. The alliance was no longer reluctant. It was survival.